Hello, everyone. Thank you for remaining here this nice Saturday afternoon. All right, so kudos to everyone that had spoken previously. Tommy, you did awesome. We'll talk about a little bit of Tommy in a moment. So we're going to talk about Silver Sparrow. It's a Mac malware, and this is a bit of a story about that malware and how we use threat hunting to help us uncover it and keep an eye on it as the story unfolded. So you're in MAYhem 2021. The agenda for today is a little bit about us, who we are. We're going to do a little recap of Silver Sparrow. We're going to talk about threat hunting. Then we're going to do another review of Silver Sparrow from our point of view. And, some takeaways, something that maybe might be useful to you. And if we got time, some questions. So really quick about us. I am part of the Paranoid team. Tommy is a hacker that goes to HackerOne, and he keeps us busy sometimes. I'm an incident response, and he's part of the Paranoid program. So it's kind of nice to see him talk about his experience. So this talk is made possible by other coworker. He's going by Agent K in this case. So Agent K, thank you for all the work and the fun times we spend on doing some of this work. And I go by Plug. My name is actually Carlos. I'm into synthesizers. You probably can see something in the back. And I lead the threat hunting program for the Paranoids, and I do incident response. So let's jump into Silver Sparrow. Now, this stuff might be a little dense at times, so bear with me. I'm going to try to, dissect everything and make it super easy. Silver Sparrow is a malware that came to light on February 18th, 2021. You can see here a screenshot of the news. It made the news because it was is a very interesting piece of malware. So this malware made the news because it was the first one, on quotes, that actually targeted both macOS Intel processors and the new M1 ARM processors. So it was able to basically infect both types of machines. That was a new. But for us, what this malware did, it kind of hinted to a larger ecosystem and the potential for supply chain paper install scheme. And we'll talk about more what that might mean. So the full recap of why this malware is interested is it infected both Intel and ARM chips. According to news, there were about 29, 30, even upper numbers of infected hosts. The activity started since late August 2020, and it made the news later in February. So this malware was active for quite some time until it made the headlines. Now, the most interesting, or one of the most interesting things, perhaps, is that there was no payload. Malware got installed on your machine, and then nothing happened. The secondary payload that you would expect that does whatever the malware is supposed to do never arrived. And that made this malware a lot more interesting. Part of the whole, part of the malware is there was this mysterious Insu file, and it wasn't sure, no one knew what the purpose of that file is. So we're going to try to answer that in here, and we're going to try to answer that through threat hunting point of view. So for us, this led into this talk, what is this mysterious Insu file? And what you see in there is the actual picture of my coworker. Now, I want to deter a little bit because what I do is threat hunting. And one of the things that help us in this case is to actually do threat hunt, and we were able to find a TTP, and that helped us uncover Silver Sparrow as it evolved. So because I do threat hunting, and threat hunting is an interesting topic that a lot of people are jumping in, I felt it was important to address it. So let's kind of deviate a little bit from here. Now, one of the things that I like to talk when I do threat hunting is this concept of the known and unknowns. And we're going to read this quote really quick. This quote was done by Donald Rumsfeld. It happened during the Iraq War. And he quoted this, and usually we'll put a video, but it says, there are known knowns. There are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns, that is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also known unknowns. There are things we don't know, And if you're wondering what does that mean, I don't blame you. So let's kind of unfold what that means and why this is important for many things we do, especially when you do threat hunting. So there are known knowns, there are known unknowns, there are unknown knowns, and then there are the unknown unknowns. When I do threat hunting, I try to concentrate on the last one. So let's talk about what the known and unknowns are. So in this case, a known is, and known knowns are the things that we know, like us, the security team on a company, and also an adversary knows, right? So for example, we know that we have a firewall in Office X, but the adversary knows about that firewall because they discovered through some network scans. So we both know about that firewall. Then there are the known unknowns. Now this one is on our favor because we know about it, but the adversary doesn't know. So the things we know and an adversary does not know. For example, we use an application X to protect our company. Maybe we have some secret sauce, no one knows about it, but the adversary doesn't know it. So we got the upper hand in that case. Now we get into the interesting territory. These are the things that are the unknown knowns. This is actually where things don't work in our favor. The things we don't know, but an adversary knows. A good example of these could be maybe an employee left credentials in GitHub, right? We're not aware, maybe our detections didn't trigger, or for whatever reason, we don't know. But maybe an adversary has kept eye on those credentials, and now they're aware of them, and they could use them against us. We don't know, they know about it. The more interesting part is the things that we don't know and they don't know, the unknown unknowns. So what is this? Unknown unknowns. So again, things we might not know, but an adversary might not know either. We're both kind of blind to that. A good example of this would be maybe an employee did a network change in a router or firewall, and an access list, an ACL, got dropped, and now people can connect from the internet to systems that they shouldn't. For whatever reason, we don't know about that, and an adversary doesn't know yet, so we're blind to it. Maybe the antivirus in your office stopped working. It didn't trigger an alert, I don't know, but an adversary doesn't know either, and so they can use that against us. So now that we know a little bit what all of these combinations or known and unknowns are, how do we find the known and unknowns? What do we do about that? Well, this is when we use threat hunting. Threat hunting will be one way in which we can find all of these things. But before we jump into that, let's define what is threat hunting. Now, in Wikipedia, there is this definition of what threat hunting is. And according to that is the process of proactively and iteratively searching through networks to detect and isolate advanced threats that evade existing security solutions. I think that is actually too complex of a description. And for me, it is actually much more simple. Threat hunting is just a methodology to proactively look for the unknown unknowns. And we talk about what those things might be. So I already did talk about this. You can find it if you search for plug threat hunting. But one of the things that is very important in my case is that all the threat hunting I do is hypothesis based. I come up with a hypothesis and I use that to basically do everything else that goes from there on. And I found that is extremely useful and is probably the best way to approach threat hunting, in my opinion. And the reason why a hypothesis is important is because by definition, it's a supposition or proposed explanation. And you kind of have to, you don't have evidence. You have to choose the evidence, develop experiments. And it's through that investigation that you will decide whether you found an answer for your hypothesis. You prove it or disprove it. That's the ultimate goal. So that's why I like it. When I do hypothesis, one of the things that I try to follow is use the 6 W's: who, what, why, where, when, and how. How am I gonna hunt for this data? Now, this is where it gets really complex for a lot of people. But in reality, threat hunting is basically leveraging just your SIEM for the most part. At the end of the day, if you don't do any tests or anything, And so what you're gonna do is you're just gonna generate queries to go and try to answer the question that you set yourself to go and prove or disprove. And ideally, your queries will be designed to answer those questions: where, what, when, right? And so that really, in a nutshell, is threat hunting. And if you want to try it, that's really all you really need to do. Come up with a hypothesis, develop some queries, off you go, and prove or disprove what you have. Now, there's a lot more to it, and like I said, there's a talk about it, and anyone wants to more dive into it, I'll be around. But now that we more or less explain what threat hunting might be, right? Let's kind of end these detour and then dive into these persistent item. So one of the things that led me into this talk and us to uncover something is research. Sometimes when you threat hunting, you want to do some research. And in macOS, there is these concept of the launch agents and daemons. So let's explain that a little bit, what they are. So normally you have what is called a plist. Plist is the configuration file that tells the daemon or the agent to start, stop. And what will happen is that you kind of have the two kinds. The launch daemon usually runs without a logged on user. There is no GUI interaction. It's storing the paths that you see in here. And it's important that you are familiar with these paths. It looks like it's an XML file for the most part, and it looks like the way you see it on the screen. And then you have also the launch agents, and the launch agents basically is another plist file that looks exactly the same. The difference is these are associated with a user. The user must be logged on, right? So you log on, agent kicks in. There might be GUI interaction. There is stored in different paths within the operating system. And the way that you can think about all of this is they're analogous to the run keys or the servers in Windows. So they're kind of like the startup file that tells the service this is the conditions you need to actually go and run. And so if you want to get persistence in macOS, then you need to somehow deploy one of these and use it to leave your shell running or malware. So that led me into do a little bit of research. And I'm going to walk you more or less, because we're using the threat hunting perspective to kind of see what will be the roadmap. Like if you wanted to do this, how would you do it? So the first thing I did is, well, let's first look at MITRE. And for those of you that are new, MITRE is U.S. government agency, or not agency, like an organization, not for profit, and they develop these ATT and CK framework. Basically, is a way to map adversaries and their tactics and techniques, and how they've used them across the kill chain. You compromise something, there's this chain that you normally follow, and this is a way to document all the different things that multiple actors have used. So it's a good way for you to figure out, what research has been done, or maybe the things you want to threat hunt or the things you want to develop detections for. So I just went there, and we're looking at plist files, right? Because after all, I want to look for the launch daemons and agents. So I just did that. I searched for that. Then I color coded MITRE, map, just to see, where there was data, and zoom into expand that. Now you have zoom techniques. So I expanded, and as you can see somewhere in here, there's the launch agents and launch daemons. So what I did then is I started doing some small research, what else I can do, and I come across plist-body. I was not familiar with plist-body, honestly, at the time. I was familiar, but not to this level. I've seen it, but I didn't pay attention to it. So plist-body is basically a program that is provided with macOS, and it allows you to create or edit the plist files that are in the operating system, basically these XML type files that I talked about earlier. Now, what I did next is, well, is there, like, someone has actually done a lolbeing, like a living of the land, and leveraged this tool to do something, and I didn't find anything. So I did what I will do. I basically started searching for things, right? Yahooing, Googling, and I didn't find anything. I found a bunch of blog posts about how to properly use it. I went to GitHub, and I didn't find any offensive tools that were leveraging at the time, and there were no security projects that were using it. So that became very interesting. So, all right, off I go. So I developed my hypotheses, right? So adversaries might be leveraging built-in operating system tools like plist-body to create persistence in order to avoid detection when running, copying, or installing plist files. That was the idea. Well, let's try to go through the process. So read everything about plist-body that I could do, and I figured out that there were in general, by looking and doing a statistical analysis on all the telemetry that I have at my disposal, that there were a few operations within Pulis body that can, with a high level of confidence, signal anomaly. And I'm going to walk you through what that is. So in other words, there's a lot of Pulis body activity. You have them, if you defend macOS networks, then you will see a lot of that. But there are a few things that are very, very rare. And that gives you a high level of confidence to create detections. So, using Pulis body, I created a pill list. And so this is the walkthrough of how I created the pill list, right? So these are the steps. I went and issue all of these commands on my little terminal, and I run all of this. Now, I highlighted one in particular because this is the one that turned out to be very interesting because it allowed me to actually do the persistent and do something with it. Now, after I created that little script, then basically I wanted to review it. Does this look, right? And so basically I printed to the screen, the script, and you can actually see here the contents of that script. For this particular test, I'm not covering. What I wanted to do is I had a little Empire shell, and I wanted to make sure that it basically will come back anytime that someone logged in or rebooted the system. And what you see in here is that I'm basically trying to run Python 3, and Python 3 is going to point to, that the hunt.py file, and it's going to run that at load. So every time that someone, the system loads, right? So then one of the tests that I did is, well, let's test this manually. Let's see if these will actually do something, right? And then it did. What you see in here is basically the result of my test. What you can see in here is that the Pulis body did run. It was under Python, and basically I had my persistence. So this was actually very important because at this stage I realized, wait a second, these run a load, it is actually interesting. And by digging a little bit further, I found that it's almost rare. It almost never happened in the way that I did it. And that would have been a hint. So what ended up happening is Pulis body add run add load turned out to be an interesting artifact. And it was a great way to create persistence. There was no reference in any offensive blogs about it. At that point in time, no malware had used it before. No malware. I haven't seen the malware doing that. So for me, it was a success. Yay, we found something cool, and we now kind of all about detection. And so off you go. We discovered a new persistent mechanism that had not been made public yet. Great. Or maybe someone knew about it. It was just not public. So this is important because this Pulis body activity became a key TTP that will help us uncover what will be known as Silver Sparrows. So let's dive into Silver Sparrows. Let's talk about what that is, and what we knew, and what maybe we can tell you now that maybe wasn't clear in the beginning. So in order for us to understand Silver Sparrow, what we're going to talk about 3 different clusters of malware, and I'm going to talk about those clusters. We're going to skip one of them, the CL3. No time for it. But so the first cluster is what we call overlapping techniques, right? So these are infections that took place just weeks prior to Silver Sparrow. They both share similar techniques or IOCs as reported in Silver Sparrow reports, right? Then there is the Silver Sparrow infections. And these are infections that we saw took place on both Intel and MI processors. And then the last cluster is an instance case in which we actually saw Silver Sparrow try to install itself in next to another piece of malware, and how it tried to kind of remove itself, and the poor job that it did at that. And it was actually fascinating to see it, to be honest. But we're going to concentrate on this cluster 1 for a period of time, because these will be the clusters that will provide some of the key answers. Part of the beauty of this malware is that there were a few unknowns. What was the purpose? What was that Insu file for? So let's look into that mysterious Insu file. So like I said, we created a cluster and we looked into the Insu file. What is this Insu file? So from our telemetry, the first time we actually saw the Insu file in our telemetry was on August 14, 2020. Now, what we basically can tell you is that the Insu file is just an artifact that was left over by other malware. It had nothing to do with Silver Sparrow. it came from another malware. Could it be that the same developer or the same firmware was used in the past? Possible, but it's not connected to Silver Sparrow. It's basically an empty file that get created during infection, right? And we basically use that file to find a cluster. Now, this cluster is actually quite interesting. So if you have some virus total, here are some of the V hashes. You need to have like a special account to go and look at that intelligence data. But I have some screenshots for you. So basically, if you go on and start looking into the Insu cluster, you're going to find a few interesting hashes. But there's also something very interesting. If you take a look at the name of the application, the word search keeps coming up. Public character search, SearchNet, expert character search. You go into a different cluster, general channel search, global toolbox search, search everywhere. So these cluster one or Insu file, it's kind of interesting because a lot of the malware infections had to do with applications that had the word search or find on them. And that in itself is probably another talk for another time, but is one that, is actually interesting on its own. And again, it had nothing to do with Silver Sparrow. Now, this Insu cluster was active for a few months. Like I said, we only in our telemetry saw it from August 14 to the 9th. I want to remind everyone, we're not like antivirus or like a security firm. We're just basically a security team that is, defending our network. And so there might be a lot of data sets we don't have access. So these dates are from our point of view. Now, the connection to Silver Sparrow comes from the fact that this file was using Silver Sparrow. So there was a check. So what Silver Sparrow will come in and say, hey, if this file exists, I'm going to remove it myself from this machine that I just infected. So I'm going to uninstall my way out of this machine. And so that was the only thing that was, and actually that in itself is an interesting question, right? But in our opinion, this file has been misattributed to Silver Sparrow. It has nothing to do with it. There are other questions that come up from, the use of this file. What was the intent? Is there a connection with this cluster and the developers of Silver Sparrow? Possibly, right? I mean, maybe there's a way to keep track of infections. And we believe that that was kind of like, Tommy alert to the fact that you will hack and you drop, like, hey, I was here kind of thing. So this Insu file is kind of like, hey, I'm here already. Don't mess around with my operation. But this Insu cluster becomes actually interesting because according to the news, there were more than 29, 30,000, 40,000 infections. And so this is a screenshot that came from the report that was made by Malwarebytes. But since we know that the Insu file is actually not connected to Silver Sparrow, then it's fair for us to infer that the actual number of infections was actually lower, 2,000 to 3,000. And I'm just going counting by the data that Malwarebytes provided. It could be even less. Now, that in itself is also another very interesting question, because this is a much smaller operation. And I believe that it was great that all of these vendors made this public just at the right time, in my opinion. So as far as us, we're concerned, we basically solved the mystery of what this Insu file was used, and it was basically related to other malware. Now, here's another thing that I don't think is known. There is another cluster, and we call it the King cluster, and it's because of the particular name reference into that file. I'm not going to go into this particular one on details because there might be another presentation that could be made about this cluster. But the important thing about this cluster is that we first saw it in our telemetry on August 20th of 2020. And it was the first malware that I know of that actually leveraged for the first time the Pilis body persistent technique that we had uncovered. So this is great. Hey, first time, what is this? Who's using it? What is this malware, right? And so this is the first known sample that I know of that leveraged that technique. Now, again, this cluster, there might be maybe folks that are looking into that, so I will not go into details, but it's relevant because it has this overlapping technique. And so we saw that this technique was later used by Silver Sparrow as it began its activities. What is actually very interesting is that King cluster that started on the 20th basically slowed down, and then by the 28th, when we first saw the first sample of Pilis body, King cluster had gone away. So the question is, are these two connected? Well, the reality is that King Cluster actually did have a payload. There was malware and it did a few things. Pilly's body did not. And so that is interesting. But it leveraged basically similar techniques. And one of the most important ones is that Pilly's body. So basically, that's what I want to say. So why is all of this important? Well, why all of this pre-explanation is important because now we know that the Insu file is related to other malware. We now know that probably the number of infections reported is actually lower. We know there was another malware that leveraged Pilly's body. And we know that all of this sort of ended or transitioned into what became Silver Sparrow. So now let's talk about Silver Sparrow. What is that? What is that malware and why it's interesting? So again, key TTP for us was the fact that it was using Pilly's body for persistence. Now, the team behind Red Canary did a great job on documenting everything that has to do with Silver Sparrow. So if you haven't read, I would recommend you do. Kudos to Tony and team. I think they made it super easy to read and digest all of the information. So I won't go into many of the information they already covered because they already covered and they've done a great job. However, we're going to cover this a little bit from the point of view of our network, right? Here in the team of the Paranoids, we actually open source a tool, and the name of the tool is called Alchemy. It was known before as Moloch. This is a nice network visibility tool that allows you to connect PCAPs and observe the network traffic. So we are going to leverage this tool for this part of the conversation to talk about, some things Silver Sparrow. So when it comes to Silver Sparrow, it has a flow on how the infections took place. What you can see in this screen is basically us looking into that activity, right? And kind of following the activity and keeping an eye on what's going on. So this is a little too dense to read. We're going to have a blog post where you can get a lot more information about this. But in general, if you were looking at a Moloch, what you see on the screen will be more or less the infection chain, right? The way that it works. And I'll dive a little bit into it. Now, what you really cannot see is that there is a lot of parameters within these queries that turn out to be a lot of very interesting things. We're just not going to have time to kind of cover all the URI parameters. And so we're going to only dig into a few of them, and you can read all about them. Why are we covering all of this? Well, one of the things that happen, and I don't hear often, is when you do threat hunting, most of the folks that currently do threat hunting, they heavily concentrate on the host side of things. And this is our way to say, you have to compensate and you have to actually look at the network side of things. And you can do a lot of awesome and very interesting threat hunt on the network side. And sometimes that will give you clues to actually uncover even more things. So we're trying to walk you through an approach into how you do that. So the way Silver Sparrow works is normally there was some sort of search related endpoint on a CDN. In this example, it was one on Akamai. And so basically what you seem to have is you're a user, you open a browser, you search for something, and that's when the sort of chain kind of begins. Silver Sparrow will collect a Q parameter that you see in here. And so that is the search term you use, like I want to buy shoes, right? And then there's another value, the PQ value or PJ value. And this is a unique ID that kind of tracks you down. So you do the search, and this is a unique identifier to your machine. And that is the beginning of everything. So at that point, you are searching for something. You are going to be then redirected to a website. The website we saw on our telemetry the most, and the one that was doing the most activity, is this one, standardconnection.com. I believe it's still live, so hopefully that's going to be gone down fairly soon. And what you will see here is the view from our Alchemy tool. You basically are being redirected into this site, and you can see in here the 302. It's moved, but there's actually some parameters that are kind of hidden in there. We filter a few things because there might be some sensitive data, so you're not going to see everything in here. But Then once you're redirected, then you're redirected yet again. It's almost like, I want to make sure that you're a Mac and you meet the criteria. And if so, then you're going to be a possible target for me to infect. And so we get a secondary redirection itself to standard connection. And across that redirection, there are some values that you might be able to see on this screenshot. And again, I'm detailing those on our blog post. But there's a lot of values that are kind of carry over since the inception of the search. At that point, you will be redirected to an S3 bucket in AWS. And at this point, you're now, it's very likely you're going to be infected. You know, this is, you're good, you know, you meet the criteria to go and become an infected. And so what we can see in here again is a 302, but there is this information that keeps being passed on to be sent you to download the malware. Now, there is another side that I don't think has been made public, and is this one, valid function. We saw it across, you know, basically everything we looked into. And in our opinion, this valid function side was basically tracking telemetry, and it was actually connected to the download of the malware. One of the key things is that there is URI, within the parameters on the URI, there is this value called DL click, which basically is download click, and it will keep track of who's downloading the click. Why is all of this important? Well, this is important because it really tells us that there is an ecosystem of malware in macOS, and someone is making money of these installations. And you need to have a way to track back how someone arrived to you, right? So like it came from this website, and then how many downloads are being taking place, and then later on how many infections are being taking place. That's how you monetize your infrastructure and your malware. So this is kind of interesting to see it unfold in here. Now, this could be a little dense, but on the valid function, there are a few parameters, and hopefully you can see it in here in red. And those are actually interesting parameters because, again, they're tracking your UUID, basically who you are. And that allows them to, again, be able to be aware of who is that they're infecting. Now, there are other parameters that are at play in here. And there is this value STU or U parameters, right? And so they're kind of carry over on every redirection. So all of these is, again, it leads us to believe that there is some sort of monetization taking place. So once you go through this chain, right, and you go through all of these different redirections and you're being sent to some place, you eventually land onto the final destination, which is this domain, the update. And that changed. I believe that it didn't change. Honestly, don't remember. But basically, that's where you will eventually download the malware that will then use a specific technique that, again, you can read all about on the Red Canary blog on how it infected through leveraging on the installer a bit of the JavaScript. So this is what it looks like when you're looking at the network side. You can actually zoom in into this particular screen. Now, one of the things I didn't do is that there are a few set of values on the get portion. So if you were to zoom in into this get portion here, you will be able to see some values. All of these URI parameters become huntable. You can actually now go and use them to start looking for things that might be related to the cluster or not. And that's why these network telemetry becomes very important. So you can see, for example, here, these get stats with that TRLP event too. What we can tell you is that that event is actually very unique, and you can actually use that event to go and hunt for things. And you will find a lot of other interesting things when you start looking into that. You might uncover even more domains that are related to this or different malware types. Again, it all points to an interesting ecosystem that is, maybe pay-per-click, infection. So when you download the malware, this is some sort of the connections that you will see. You can see here the 200OK, basically, you are now being infected. As you are then later infected, the malware, and this is the part that made it very interesting, is going to start doing some curl beacons. Now, for us, we have this thing called the pickle call, and the pickle call basically is related to the curl. So from the host side, what you will see is just a curl to any of those two domains, API mobile traits and API special attributes, API mobile traits and API special attributes.com. But there is this called the pickle call. Now, what do we call the pickle call? Because the URI parameter has a PKI on it, or L, don't remember if it's an I or an L. And you can clearly see in here the screenshot that is basically talking to the API and is doing a post. Now, in addition to that, you can see the curl engine. So these as itself, this is a screenshot. That could be something you can actually hunt. You can look for these things and it will help you to uncover other things. There is this value about the MN PK install, which is basically a package install parameter. And we believe that the M belongs to the machine ID. Now, the machine ID is something I didn't cover, and it will be on the Red Canary blog. It is basically collected through a particular process, a command that you will run that collects information about your operating system and serial number and other information. And all of that basically gets blurb and basically it gets passed on, right? I want to keep track of who am I infecting and all the system information. So all of that is being sent on that curl out. Here you can see that as part of that API, you basically see a check on that package. And the most important thing is that this API was basically looking for, what is my next phase, right? So you install them, you infect the machine, and these will happen almost on an hour. So it was phoning home, right? You can see these curls that are taking place. And this is actually interesting because, actually, let me stop back in here. You see these curls happening, right? But what made this malware interesting is you are pulling a JSON file that will give you instructions. What am I going to do next, right? So imagine that you just are a red team or an adversary. You compromise a machine. You have now your beacon in there, but you are not delivering any payload. You're waiting for like the next stage. Well, in this case, the secondary stage never happened, but it was there and ready. And that's what made this malware actually interesting and scary at the same time, because it could have got really, really worse. So that's about Silver Sparrow. But since we're talking about threat hunting, I want to take the time to kind of walk you through other ideas that hopefully, even if you didn't know about Pilly's Buddy, that you could have used or you can now use to uncover other malware like Silver Sparrow or your red team or adversaries. So taking the data from the blog post from Red Canary, because it did a good job and it just makes it easy for me to explain it, there are a few things that Silver Sparrow will do. And all of those become huntable and things that you can actually use to look for things. So the first one is, the curls that we saw, right? So there is this curl after the machine gets infected that will take place. And so one of the things you can do is you can hunt for curl activity happening on your temp directory. Now I'll tell you this, based on my telemetry and my experience, curls that involve JSON files in the temp directory will probably be rare, but these varies by organization. In my experience, they're rare, and so it's worth to look at them. Then you have this notion of curl beacons, right? So now you not only have the fact that there might be a one-time curl, but the fact that it's beaconing, it just keeps happening all the time. So that becomes even more telling. What in the heck is, keeps it running curl every X amount of time and is pointed to this, unknown JSON file in the temp directory. So that becomes huntable, and this is a good way to see it. You can see here that almost on the hour, this thing was actually, phoning home. And that will be one interesting thing that you can actually go and hunt. Now, this is another one that is interesting. In macOS, there's a lot of built-in tools, and the PL-util is basically a tool that is commonly used by legit operations within the operating system and other applications inside the macOS ecosystem. But based on my experience and the way that Silver Sparrow behave, what sets this command apart is that -r value. That value, it is rare. At least in my telemetry, the telemetry I have access, it is not very common. And this, if you want to take it and go and just search for it on your telemetry, might help you cover other things. Now, what the area is doing is basically try to properly read, the JSON and so format it properly for the plist. But it is very unique. Now, when you do hunts like this, you want to count that the letter R or that parameter could be at any time, in different positions within the query. So make sure that you create a query that accounts for all of that. But in my personal opinion, any activity connected to this particular portion of the command will be likely rare. And in my opinion, it will be of high confidence and is a good command to look for detection opportunities. Now, another thing that happens often in Silver Sparrow is no different, is you can look into SQLite, and macOS has these quarantine events. Basically, when a file gets downloaded, it's verified, is this a developer or not, and a few other things that we'll not go into. But so what some of the malware do is they kind of try to leverage, they will use that to collect some information or to bypass some things, as it was made recently or some months ago made public. The whole point is you want to kind of look into the SQL3 and the quarantine events. What I can tell you is that plenty of malware loves to play with this, and Silver Sparrow did exactly the same. So legit operations will be taking place, but for the most part, anyone that is using SQL3 to look into quarantine events and then trying to do some queries to dump the files, as you can see, into some temp folder, then that is extremely rare and that will not be legit. So you can definitely look into that. Another thing you can actually do, and this is probably one of the most interesting one, is macOS, in this case, there's an installer. You can follow the installer process, and by looking into the installer process, you might find some very interesting finds. Now, before you go into this, if you're doing threat hunting, I recommend you do some statistical analysis, right? Understand how does the installer activity looks in your network, and then you kind of start removing some of the noise that is legit, and then you start zooming into the things that start to look rare. So if you do this, zoom into activity within the temp directory. That was a key TTP for Silver Sparrow and for a lot of malware, but also keep yourself aware of something related to the PK install sandbox. And again, this is related to the fact that there's a sandbox, and make sure that the software is legit and so forth. So there's going to be a lot of installer activity connected to the PK install sandbox. Just remove it and filter that out, and then you're going to be left over with very interesting stuff. So hopefully at this point, some curious eyes, some viewers have noticed that a lot of the stuff that I've been talking is sort of connected to this temp folder. And that is actually quite interesting, because as you start looking into the activity of these and other malware, it starts to get weird. I mean, I don't know you, but maybe some developers or other folks will actually create an SH file within the temp directory, but it's the connection of activity. There's a lot of other commands that are taking place. Now, in this screenshot, you can actually see the IOReg command, and that basically command is the one that I alerted that early, that allows you to collect some information that will be identifiers for your machine that eventually are sent out on that API curl call when the malware was phoning home. So even looking into this might be of interest. Now, there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of legit stuff that will use it, but again, connected to temp, that starts to get interesting. And that is the case when it comes to Silver Sparrow and a lot of other malware. So what I really recommend, if you're new to this, or if you're seasoned, if you haven't done it, is basically track activity within the installer and map it to the temp directory. You're going to find a gold mine of activity. And that in itself would have been the clue for you to find Silver Sparrow if you didn't know about anything else, because it would have signaled that there's some activity in there that is very interesting, especially as it started doing the beacon later on. It just kept on using that temp folder. So you definitely want to zoom in into that temp folder and connect the installer. What I'm going to try to do later on is to release some detections, the Sigma rules, so you can have them and you can play with them. So stay tuned for that. But meanwhile, this will help you to kind of identify this malware. So let's do a recap and some takeaways on this. So first, I hope that I can show you that threat hunting does pay off, right? We knew about the TTPs way ahead of time, and if you track on similar things, you will have found or still could find very interesting stuff. I do want to say something that when it comes to this pillar's body, it really is not groundbreaking. I didn't discover something, like that I think is really that groundbreaking. It's just I just followed the process, and the process led me into identifying something that's become interesting. And at the time, I had not seen any telemetry or any abuse about it. And so that is the interesting part in here. When you do threat hunting, not everything has to be groundbreaking. You might stumble across some things that will become significant at any point. And that is why I like what I do. And this is why I recommend you take that, hypothesis approach, and you develop some test cases and you go through it. And if you follow the process, you will might find or uncover interesting stuff. Again, in this case, what ended up happening is no references about using Billy's body for persistence anywhere, and it turned out to be that by us creating that detection, we were able to keep an eye on this malware and alert whenever it was in use. Another important thing is we were able to determine that the Insu file is basically related to other malware. And as a result, we can use and say that the original announcement about the number of infections is actually, exaggerated, and more likely is much more lower, 2,000 to 3,000 infections. Now, that actually opens the door for a lot of multitude of questions that I'm not going to be able to answer here. But one of the interesting questions that for me, becomes at play is, is there a framework that some of these malware developers are using, or was this a single developer that is selling these to buyers? There is definitely an ecosystem of malware, especially adware, that is being applied and is used, and that is significant. It's important to note, and we kind of show that that is at play in here. But what this would have been super interesting is what was the next stage. And in my opinion, the operators kind of messed up on that one. And I think that the call that was done by Red Canary to bring it to the light with all the other vendors like Malwarebytes was great. Basically end this, because it could actually get really bad, and there's no reason to keep an eye on it. It hasn't happened. And it is a recipe for disaster if the second pillar would have come on. It could have been really, really bad. So with that said, I've reached the end of the talk. I just want to take the time to do some props, obviously to Red Canary. Special kudos to Tony Lambert. I get the chance to talk to him. He actually likes to share a lot of stuff. So kudos, Tony. You're a good friend. Want to say thank you to the MAYhem CitySec team. Thank you for inviting me and allowing me to be part here. Andy Week and Ellie, they're part of the Archimate community. This is a tool that we open source that you can go and download for free and deploy it and get really good network telemetry. And that will help you in your threat hunting activities or forensic investigations. I want to say thank you to the partners involved. Daniel Collins, our awesome security team, Agent TK, which is the packet connoisseur, and Sean Esposito. He is the Wizard of Words and helped us on the blog and paying attention that I didn't have any typos in here. So thank you everyone to get involved. The team I'm part of, the fire team and all of the fire team. And with that, just want to say thank you. Thank you for watching. Hopefully this was of use to you. And if you have any questions, I'm around. Let me know. Happy to answer anything. And especially if it's threat content related, happy to do it.
Okay, thank you so much, Block. There was so much information that I'm happy that we are actually recording this, and you can go back to them and reverse. So I do have some questions which I picked up from here, and there's the one: does the newest macOS Big Sur make things significantly harder for malware authors?
So yes, the Apple ecosystem in some way, yes. The Apple ecosystem has created certain things to make that a little bit more difficult. Now, on the flip side, because the Apple ecosystem is kind of a little bit closed, and not a lot of people are exploring it, especially on iPhones. iPads. There's a lot of stuff we don't know, and there's a lot of possible 0 days that exist, and they're basically gone unnoticed. As far as your machine, Big Sur did change a few things that are making it a little more difficult. Recently, there was, I actually, as part of this testing, one of the things that I didn't mention, I was using another technique that I didn't know was actually a vulnerability on macOS that was made public by Cedric recently, and it got a CVE. Basically, you could bypass the sandbox that macOS uses. So I think that one of the good things is that Apple has done a really good job at trying to make sure that you're protected. And I think Big Sur is a step forward into that protection.
Okay, so the next question is there a common theme in macOS malware, and what is the usual objective of Mac malware authors?
So there seems to be, in general, there is a common theme, and you will find that one way you can make money on macOS malware is basically you get install an application. I show you a cluster that is about search, right? All the apps got to do with search. So, you know, it could be an add-on on your browser, and is basically you're throwing redirects to websites, and you basically get money of those visits, whether they happen on the background if you know or not. But the problem is that that initial lower level adware usually lends itself to then be used by much more nefarious malware. So if you think about it, as a malware operator, I have an incentive to infect some machines and then monetize off of them and then sell you, access, which I have no proof that that is taking place, but I wouldn't suspect that, that it's already happening. And to be honest, Silver Sparrow, it did seem that it had all the capabilities to be exactly that. It's just we never saw the secondary payload.
Okay, so I think we can take a few more here. So how would you go about building a forensic lab for macOS malware, and creating macOS virtual machine isn't as easy as Windows or Linux?
So actually, it's actually fairly easy. You could totally, well, if you have a Mac, it's really easy. You basically download the ISO for your Mac operating system. You download VMware Fusion, and you basically run VMware Fusion on top of your machine or any of the hypervisors. And yeah, it could totally run Apple operating system. If you have a PC, it gets a little more tricky and more difficult. I really haven't tried that in a long time. I have a powerful laptop that allows me to basically do that. Now, AWS, Amazon, now offers the services where you can actually go on and spawn an instance that will be macOS. It's not as cheap, so it's expensive. So be prepared to spend some money. I do recommend that you basically do a mini lab, and that's what I do. I have in my at home, I have my mini lab, and another thing you could do is literally buy an older laptop that has enough RAM, and that will allow you to run things. And so what you want to do is, if you do that, I will recommend that you look into the Objective-C tools. Patrick has done a great job and has a bunch of free tools out there that will be useful. If you want to do some malware analysis, definitely install something like OS Query. It's completely open source, and you will be able to collect logs. There's a few other tools out there that will look into the process, and I can get a list and share it on the channel if needed. There's a set of tools that I kind of like to use and allows you to kind of look into the process activity and whatnot. There's another very interesting book for anyone that wants to get into this world of macOS that is by Jonathan Levy, and is basically 3 very amazing books on all about macOS that I recommend reading. And I'll put a link. But basically, it's super easy. Just get the ISO, run VMware, and off you go. And just deploy the tools that you want to use to kind of keep an eye on the malware.
Okay, I'm going to take the last question, and then we can continue the. So, was the quarantine event a sort of convenient async way to get a handle when the payload has been successfully loaded on the machine? Did the did the question presenter got it right, or is it?
Oh, I guess this is the references about the why did the quarantine check took place, right? So basically, in this case, the quarantine query is basically the malware after installing is trying to collect a few things to be able to track back how, which machines are being installed and the URLs. So in macOS, whenever you download a file from the internet, there is a table that basically tracks where those files are being downloaded. And that allows you to basically query whatever you want in there and find a URL or a parameter. And in this case, I have no mistaken for that portion of Silver Sparrow. Basically what it's doing is looking for a particular field. And that field was used to basically track how is these infections getting in there. Now, some malware might use the quarantine files to bypass it, the sandbox, and that was a vulnerability that existed that other malware leverage. So there are techniques in which you will use the SQL command to look into it, to either read contents and then take those and put them into a file. And if you look at the slides, you will see that it is looking for a particular field and is being put into these SH file, if I'm not mistaken. So that was more the intent, not to bypass, but to pull information about the download. I believe, not 100% at this time. I need to look at it again, but I believe that was the reason for it. Hopefully that is the question. Let me know if that is the case. If not, happy to clarify anything.
Yeah, I think you can actually continue the discussion on our channel chat. So there was the question, and you can actually find the person who was asking it. And I think this was excellent day. I've been really thrilled to be able to actually host you all. And I'm really thanking you, Block, for hopping in here. It was really amazing to listen to all of your talks. And yeah, so if you are still online, I highly recommend everybody to actually join into our Discord server. There you can actually continue the talk and find the table and have a chat. It's great. They have got you the really fun stuff there going on. And I think that was all. And the ones who are still online, congratulations, you just survived the mayhem.
Thank you for inviting me.